The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. Hope you're all well. This week's show is sponsored by our good friends at Lumino. Today's show is focused on investment. Lumino help a lot of investment vehicles and teams to support their portfolio companies grow and get them staffed up, as well as helping build management teams. So, as always, if you are in need of HR or recruitment help, please do get in touch with them at luminorecruit.com. And obviously, please mention my name when you do so. In a brief news recap from the week, Costa Rica has just passed a bill to legalize medical cannabis this week. A small nation, but a very interesting one. As much as the cannabis movement that's happening there seems to be a growing number of psychedelic retreats available too. I frequently speak to people who've recently visited to explore opportunities over there, so it'll be interesting to see how those things progress. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago about upcoming conferences, and I'm pleased to say that I will be speaking at CB Expo in Zurich on April 14th. In a few weeks' time. If you're going to be there, I would love to meet, so please do drop me a line and hopefully we can fix something up. Now, on with the show. Enjoy. On today's show, I have Oliver Lamb. Oliver is co-founder and investment manager at Óskare Capital. Óskare are a European-focused venture capital fund. Welcome, Ollie. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Anuj. Very well, thank you. And very kind of you to have me on here.
No, a great pleasure. We've been talking for a while, so it's good to have you on the show and good that we'll be talking a bit about the UK investment landscape and all the trappings of that. But as is customary, let's begin with a bit about you and your sort of personal story. If you can give us a bit of background on what you were up to and how and why you sort of got into the cannabis space, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So as I'm sure you've heard on all your shows, there aren't really a sort of set track of reasons why someone comes to the medical cannabis industry. And I think mine is no different or no less strange. But I started out with an investment firm in Sub-Saharan Africa, so based in Harare, Zimbabwe. And after coming back to the UK, I joined Morgan Stanley in London. And after a few years there, I left to start a consultancy and accelerator, predominantly looking at the Agri-Tech space. For no better reason than I was obsessed with plants. Well, there was some other reasons. So it was around about the time that the price of light emitting diodes, so LEDs, had got down to the level where they were finally viable to be used in controlled environment agriculture. And that opened up a whole wealth of possibilities in the CEA sector, typically growing lettuces and not particularly exciting things like that in vertical farms with lots of lights. And after a couple of years of that, we suddenly saw a huge flip in what our clients, but also what the market was after. Obviously, medical cannabis had become a viable crop to grow, and that's all anyone wanted to build. And so we quickly became experts. We developed a lot of GMP production facilities across Europe. And I sort of really, just stumbled upon what is probably the opportunity of a lifetime, which is to get in on a sector that is entirely new and entirely novel and with incredibly high growth potential. And from my perspective, the most interesting part was what we saw on our accelerator side, which was that there were a whole host of new, young, exciting companies that were making use of the research, the IP, and the technology that was coming out in the medical cannabis space and capitalizing on it with various new companies, various new structures, and various new research partnerships. And from that, I knew this was something I really needed to get my feet into. So that's really what led me on the path to meet the Óskare Capital team. So I saw our chairman, Bruce Linton, who, as you probably know, is the founder and former CEO of Canopy Growth. Saw him speaking at a conference, and he talked about this shiny new investment team he joined in Europe and how he believed that European medical and pharma cannabis was the future or the third wave of growth in the cannabis sector. And so I pestered him relentlessly for an introduction to the Óskare team. he eventually quite did. And I met Alex, who's our president, Gaetano and John. And I've been with the team for coming on to 2 years now, serving as investment manager. And more recently, we just launched our UK fund. So I'm a director of the UK co. And yeah, we're building that out at the moment. And it's a very exciting time.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's quite a kind of interesting route in to sort of via equipment effectively. But interesting, I always find it interesting to speak to people that have done something in a kind of the non-cannabis agricultural sector that have sort of transferred those skills and analysis to this emerging sector. So that's very interesting. My usual question, did you encounter any stigma at all from family or friends when you were deciding to go from kind of, let's say, conservative financial services industry to the Wild West of cannabis?
Well, I think my mother still suspects I'm a drug dealer. So there is always a bit of stigma, as you well know, when you come into this industry. But no, look, I think a few years ago, when it was very much out of the public consciousness, it was very novel and had the associated stigma. But from my perspective, I see that as where the real opportunities lie. When there's a bit of arbitrage between public opinion and where the real value lies, that's where, obviously I'm coming from the investment side now, that's where investment decisions can make real impact. Getting into an opportunity that is widely underappreciated by the public because, say, they think it's just a recreational drug repackaged in a pharmaceutical bag, not necessarily realizing that this is an entirely new ecosystem of life science products with the associated sort of picks and shovels that will go along with it. So yeah, it's absolutely a strange sector to come into at the start. But I think also within that, there's a fair amount of camaraderie amongst those who've made the switch, taken the plunge and enjoying the water once in it.
Yes, yeah. It's still a bit cold for my liking, but hopefully getting warmer at some point soon. Thank you for that, Ollie. So why don't you tell us a bit more about Óskare and what you guys are up to?
Yeah, sure. So Óskare Capital is a Paris-based advisory firm. We launched Fund 1 about 18 months ago, which is focused on the European and world medical and pharmaceutical cannabis sector, prioritizing Europe. But within that, we're looking at two specific sectors or subsectors. One, life sciences and wellness, and the other side is picks and shovels. So ecosystem investments, basically anything that facilitates the development of the medical and pharmaceutical space. We've been running that up. We made 2 investments in angels, which we will be rolling into the fund, into a company called Herbalair, most recently, and Octrin, which was our first investment. Both are fantastic companies and doing really well. We've got upticks on their valuations already, which is very exciting. And more recently, which is obviously particularly of interest to me, given where I'm based, we've launched, as I mentioned, our EIS and SEIS fund, which is targeting the same sectors, but obviously specifically UK or UK operating companies that meet those criteria. So that's launched just at the end of last year. We're looking to raise the minimum 1 million by March this year. Yep, got a few targets. Very excited that we're already working with them and hopefully going to be deploying ASAP.
That's brilliant. I had Bruce and Alex on, it was a while ago now, but sort of talking about Óskare's vision. What's your USP for those that didn't catch that episode?
Well, Bruce is an excellent salesman, as I'm sure you heard, so I'll do no justice to his pitch. But, our USP is that we're a collection of quite diverse sort of expertise. So we obviously have Bruce, and we've recently got Brendan Kennedy, who is the founder and former CEO of Tilray, on the sort of senior advisory and chairmanship positions. We have the likes of Olivier Brandecourt, former CEO of Sanofi, again advising us. And in terms of our investment team, Alex, who's the president, he's got a long and shiny history in venture capital, and he's specializing typically in deep tech engineering products, but he's also now very adept at analyzing cannabis investment deals. Nicola Broughton, who's a specialist in IP, is helping out a lot with our UK fund. Josh Levy, former Mercia Asset Management, is joining our UK fund. Dr. John Rogers, a neurologist with an extensive pharma experience, he's helping out on our European fund. So I guess that's probably our primary USP. I mean, that and the fact that there aren't really well, luckily for us, that many other options in terms of European funding sources at the moment. So I think we've come at the right time. That's not to say that it hasn't been difficult in the raising of these funds. Obviously, we're still coming into contact with the various hesitancies from large institutional LPs and the compliance departments that they come with. But no, it's a very exciting time. The team has been together for 2 to 3 years now, working very well together. We've made investments together. And I think we're just looking forward to this next stage.
Yeah, fantastic. That's really good. And yeah, we all are, I think. So let's broaden out the chat, actually. And sort of, the main topic of the show is sort of talk a bit more about the UK investment landscape. Inevitably, that has wider context too. But maybe we sort of start with the UK investment landscape. Who are the sort of type of players in the space, and what type of companies are you seeing at the moment?
Well, obviously, there are investment firms, investment organizations that have been looking at the UK medical cannabis market. You have the likes of Pharmacy, which I think is headed up by Jenna Greenberg. Octopus Ventures, I know Will Gibbs is very vocal at a lot of conferences and has some very interesting insights as a sort of, an expert coming from a non-cannabis specific fund, now taking a more and more interested look at the sector. There's a Nexus and Leafy Tunnel, but they're more broadly focused on the European side of things. But in terms of UK SEIS and EIS investments, can obviously talk a bit more about the specifics of what those schemes are.
Would you mind just elaborating what those schemes are?
No, of course. I talk about it as if everyone should know, but there's absolutely no reason why anyone should know what these things are. But everyone should know, especially if they're considering putting money into any young company in the UK or that operates in the UK. So just very briefly as an overview, the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme and the Enterprise Investment Scheme are two incentive structures created by the UK government that essentially try to incentivize investments into early stage companies. And the way they do that is by offering some significant tax incentives and essentially tax rebates on the back of any investment put into a company that is EIS or SEIS eligible. And the kind of rebates you can expect, so there is 30 to 50% income tax relief, 100% inheritance tax relief, the same again, 100% tax relief growth. There's a 50% capital gains exemption on SEIS investments. And there's also, which is particularly important with young companies, because young companies don't always succeed, there's a 20 to 45% loss relief across the schemes. So what that means is that essentially, if you're putting money into a company or into a fund that invests in these companies, you are going to essentially get a lot of that money back on your next tax bill, which is obviously very attractive for retail investors, high net worth family offices, less interesting for large institutional investors who are looking to deploy large amounts of capital. And this scheme enables investors to put relatively small amounts of investment in and still get access to these schemes. So for instance, our EIS fund and SEIS fund, the MEDCAN fund has a minimum ticket size of £10,000, in comparison to our European fund, which has a minimum ticket size of €100,000, which is obviously slightly less accessible. And I guess whilst it's very much a benefit to the investor, I think it's important to remember that it's also very beneficial to the companies themselves. And that's why essentially the UK government has put these schemes up. It's because it enables companies to access capital at much earlier stages than they would otherwise be able to. And it also, especially when it comes to EIS fund investments, enables these companies to get access to expertise and teams that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get into. So, if you're a young company, you have just started out and it's the first capital or the first 150 grand you're raising, you can do that all through the SEIS scheme, which gives you the highest level of tax incentives. Now, that could typically be from friends and family or a couple of high net worth individuals, which is great. And it gets you off to a start. And, those individuals, those family members may have some expertise that they could lend to that company. But I think where the real USP is for funds that deploy into companies that can use these schemes is that then these young companies, who are often the companies that need the most help, can have access to the full spectrum of expertise that come with those funds. So that includes, monitoring, mentoring, access to the network, the fund taking board seats and guiding companies through these developmental stages. So really, it's a win-win, and it's not completely unique to the UK. Other countries do have slightly similar schemes, but to my knowledge, none are as generous or as well run as the UK is.
Fantastic. Nice heavy bit of bias there, I'm sure. But no, that's good. Obviously, I'm based in the UK, and they are very good schemes and very attractive for raising early stage investment. So thank you for elaborating on that. So, okay, we've got funds of different sorts that you're sort of talking about. What are the other types of kind of players in the space in terms of categories of investors, like private family offices and angels?
Yeah, so I mentioned before that, institutional investors have been hesitant to make commitments to funds. Well, that's the same case for individual companies. So traditional asset managers, sector agnostic venture capital firms, private equity have been hesitant to play in the medical and pharmaceutical cannabis sector. One of the most common reasons for this is that there are typically things called vice clauses in LP agreements, which mean that things like gambling or tobacco or alcohol, essentially, if there's any mention of those in a fund's investment criteria or investment targets, then essentially they aren't really allowed to do that. Now, unfairly, I would say, and I'm sure many of your listeners will agree, medical cannabis has often fallen under that vice category, despite the fact that it's, from that sector, you can derive licensed drugs, licensed by the FDA and all the major regulators around the world. But yet there is still this hesitancy from those large investors. But this creates a real opportunity for, the next tier down investors. Who am I talking about there? The likes of family offices, high net worths, and perhaps some more nimble, tend to be sort of family office funded venture capital firms. And what we've seen typically in terms of who invests in these companies, we've seen a lot of obviously family and friends rounds because it's still a young sector and the quantums of capital needed by these companies is still relatively small. But as they grow and as the sector grows, there's obviously more and more need for larger capital infusions. And that's really the impetus behind why we started Óskare Fund 1, so the European fund that looks to put around 500k up to 10 million in total lifespan of investment into each target. And we have seen, other investment firms try to do the same thing, a couple doing it successfully, some fall by the wayside. But no, it's still very much an underserved market. And to us, that's excellent. It means there's all the more opportunity for those that are in it.
Yeah, and that's quite a useful summary for sort of the different categories that you outlined. Where do you see crowdfunding fitting into this landscape?
I think as you well know, there have been some enormous crowdfunding campaigns, in particular by UK companies recently, and hats off to them. I think if you can find those capital sources at the time when you need them, then, whatever means necessary, that's great. What our perspective is that they're excellent for certain companies, in particular, marketplaces, brands who are looking to essentially expand their footprint, bring in new customers as well as just investors through that platform. For other companies, it's not always the most effective or efficient way for them to raise capital. Obviously, there are certain issues around, how many lines you have on your cap table. There are certain solutions around that. But generally, what we'd recommend, if it is an option for young companies, would be to find intelligent money. So people that can provide not only capital to help you expand, but also the expertise, the network, the hands-on nitty-gritty, helping out on the day-to-day, that will differentiate between a company with capital and a good and growing company with capital.
Yes, yeah. Everyone's searching for that strategic investor that can help with more than just money. So that does make sense. And finally, I guess one that we haven't really talked about is the public markets. I mean, that's been a bit stuttering, to be kind, I think. A lot of excitement early last year and it's kind of stalled a bit. What are your thoughts on that?
I have many thoughts on the public markets and bore people with them regularly. But no, I think it's hard to gauge where real value is if you were to just look at public market valuations. A lot of the public markets, or specifically cannabis-related public markets, are driven by retail investors. And so a lot of that is obviously sentiment-based, and that capital is notoriously flighty. So it's very susceptible to high and fast rises and very quick crashes. And so that makes for a very exciting ride for those who want to play the odds.
Who get in at the right point.
Who get in at the right point, and more importantly, get out at the right point.
Correct.
And, we saw back end of 2019, booms, busts, crazy volatility. And now, the US in particular, the stocks have been heavily depreciated. We're seeing, some of the lowest ever valuations in the markets. But from our perspective, we're not too interested in the public markets. We think that generally there could well be a sort of a wider correction in the public markets in the not too distant future. And if and when that does happen, the first money to go will be those retail investors who pull out their cash and say, okay, I'm done with that for a while. And so because of that, personally, I expect there to be significant downward pressure on cannabis stocks, given that those cannabis stocks are largely propped up where those valuations are still high by retail investors. And so our focus is very much in the private space, where there isn't that volatility, where companies can pick and choose their time to go public and take advantage of market circumstances, where there are secure inputs of capital when and if they need it. And for us, that's where our expertise lies. Obviously, the number of listings is really positive because it means that there's a significant additional exit opportunity for the companies that we work with in the private sector. But yeah, personally, I'm not putting too much money in the public space just now.
Yeah, I mean, and talking about it specifically in relation to London and the UK, I mean, do you see? I mean, I'm not a finance guy, but it seems a bit crazy that companies with very low revenues are kind of listing. It feels a bit like what's happened in Canada, before, and what is now happening in psychedelics. So, know what your thoughts are on that?
No, completely. I think that there is a rationale for a company listing very early, which is to capitalize on market sentiment. And at the moment, especially around psychedelics, as you mentioned, there is keen investor interest. And again, this is retail investor interest in these segments. And for that reason, it's relatively easy for a young cannabis or psychedelics company to capture the imaginations of the public with a strong marketing push and get some cash in the door quickly, and then sort of hope everything works out at the end. This can work out. This is not necessarily a bad strategy. However, it is a risky strategy. You're betting on an unproven concept. We, on the other hand, prefer to bet on what we know is going to succeed. And then when the time is right and the valuation can be justified, take that public or exit in the private markets. So, yeah, I mean, I think also there are a lot of headline grabbing IPOs recently. You have celebrities, the Will.i.ams, the David Beckhams, who have excellent platforms with which to perform these IPOs and can raise a lot of money on their names alone. But no, what we would always recommend is to look beyond the branding into the science and the actual service that's being provided and try and differentiate on that basis.
Yeah, I mean, the hype game is the hype game, right? And if we're able to focus on some fundamentals, maybe that might be a good way to make your investment decisions.
Sounds like a nice change.
Yes, absolutely. And so in terms of, in the UK specifically, what do you think of the quality and the volume of deal flow that you're seeing?
Well, I obviously would say this, being in the UK and having just sort of started a UK fund, but genuinely excellent. I guess it might be helpful to just to mention why we started the UK fund, which kind of addresses that question, which is that obviously raising the European fund, we were talking to a lot of UK investors. Obviously the UK and London in particular is a financial hub for Europe. And a lot of those UK investors we were talking to would ask whether we had EIS or SEIS applicable opportunities. And I think after the 5th or 10th one of those, we sort of saw the writings on the wall, finally took the hint and started this fund. And the other reason why we did so is because around 40% of all of our deal flow from the whole of Europe, including Israel, was coming from the UK. And that's pretty staggering, especially considering that in terms of recreational legalization, obviously recreational is not an area that we look at, but in terms of market sentiment, we would expect that recreational legalization would increase the deal flow from a certain country. We didn't see that correlation. We saw the UK is still housing the highest proportion of deals coming out of Europe. And interestingly, we've also seen a lot of European companies looking to rehouse at least part, or if not all, of their operations in the UK. And there are a couple of reasons why that is. But again, it makes for a very exciting prospect for our MEDCAN fund.
Fantastic. That's really good. And what sort of subsectors are you seeing that from? Is it, we talked about it before, I think you mentioned you're seeing less brands, i.e. CBD companies. It's more on the biotech, life sciences side?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of research teams who've obviously been operating sort of out of the public eye for the past 10 to 15 years, often state-sponsored research, coming to the surface and commercializing their findings. So that's really exciting. Yeah, we're seeing fewer brands now, which I think is unsurprising, as some brands look to entrench their status as sort of leaders of the pack, and more of those that come in from the outskirts see it as a crowded space. We're also seeing a lot of the problems in the industry being solved with novel technology around the extraction side, the syn bio side, contract research, contract manufacturing. Those players are now, becoming funded, getting up and running, starting to generate serious revenues and becoming established players in the sector. And in terms of those companies that we've seen particularly moving to the UK from Europe, I think there is a subset which have been doing so more than the sector in general, which is those that focus on Agri-Tech. So obviously that's my specialty, so that's what I look at a lot. But one of the benefits of the UK is that gene editing is now regulated in a very different way as it is in the European Union. This was, Brexit, for better or for worse, did have some silver linings, and this, I would argue, is one. Essentially, in the EU, genetic editing is still regulated as genetic modification. What does that mean? That means it's incredibly expensive, it's very slow to do, and it's incredibly hard to get authorization for it. Gene editing in the UK, however, is now coming under a separate framework, which will make it much easier, much less expensive, and much less time consuming. Essentially bring it in line with our US counterparts. Is that a good thing? I know that there are plenty of people who would argue that gene editing should be heavily regulated and probably can't be regulated enough. However, from my perspective, gene editing is an incredibly exciting area of agricultural development. It's particularly useful for medical cannabis when you still have a lot of therapeutics companies using phytocannabinoids and needing certain levels of THC, certain levels of CBD, certain consistency in product. And these are the kind of issues that gene editing can really help with. So, that's one, of course, one of many, I would say, advantages of the UK. But yeah, it's an exciting time to be here.
No, really good to highlight that, because that was one of my questions, to sort of talk about it in a European context. And obviously with Brexit happening, how the UK is sort of setting itself apart from Europe. But plenty of great stats there. 40% of the stuff you're seeing is coming out of the UK. That's great. So, Ollie, as we come to sort of the end, aside from regulatory change, which is what we're all hoping happens much quicker, what are the other sort of things that you think can help speed up the pace for this industry?
Well, I think it's already at a pretty good pace and growing. So I think, whilst you and I have often been frustrated that things haven't happened as quickly as we'd like them to, I think stepping back, we can see that, as a sector that's coming from essentially scratch, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've come an awfully long way, but there is a lot more distance to travel. Personally, what I would like to see cemented in the industry to help speed things up is an increase of financial services for the sector. Companies are still struggling with that on a day-to-day basis, and it's an obstacle that shouldn't be an obstacle, especially with so many flexible payment providers that there are around now. Selfishly, I'm not too fussed that the US hasn't federally legalized yet. I think that provides a competitive advantage to Europe. But I would also like to see, one thing I would really like to see is a UK cannabis specific agency. A lot of other European countries have set those up so far. And I think that the Home Office may be slightly struggling under the weight of requests from various companies about cannabis licenses, cannabis research grants, etc., etc. So I think as one simple step for the UK, that would be it.
Yes, I like that latter one. A cannabis SAR, a legal cannabis SAR, let's call it, would be good, because I do agree. I think there's many government departments that have or need to be aware of what's going on, and they aren't very joined up, I don't think. So yes, a sort of central agency is a very good idea. And I guess the only thing I would add was just generally more data and education for doctors to sort of understand more about the plant.
No, precisely. And we're seeing quite a lot of groups who are trying to tackle that problem at the moment. And that's a hugely positive step. I personally was in a neurological ring with a sort of a family member very close to me quite recently, and talking to the neurologist who was treating this person. He is an MS specialist. And to my pleasant surprise, he was saying that for a lot of his multiple sclerosis patients, he was prescribing cannabis-based medications. This is the first time I'd heard of a frontline neurologist talk about them as openly and as optimistically as that. And it was incredibly reassuring. And the anecdotal evidence that he was providing about the effect that these medications had on his patients and the quality of life improvements that they were able to provide was incredibly heartwarming. And I think should stand as a testament to what everyone in this industry is trying to do.
Yeah. Fantastic. That's a great way to close this out. Thank you very much, Ollie, for joining me. It's really great to hear about all the new things that you guys are up to, and would love to have you back in a while to sort of see how things have progressed. Hopefully things will pick up in pace and we will have lots to chat about.
That sounds great. Thank you very much, Anuj.
Cheers, Ollie. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I work with various cannabis startups to help them get funded and grow. I also work with corporates and international cannabis companies to help them understand and navigate the European cannabis sector. We're working with some great clients across the cannabis value chain, and we'd love to help you too. Please visit www.canverse.global to get in touch.